thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you about Big City Butterflies, a project in London to help discover London's butterflies and moths. It's run by Butterfly Conservation, just starting up now, and it's funded mostly by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Throughout the talk, I'll be illustrating it with photographs. Most of these are photographs I've taken myself, and mostly on my mobile phone, and that's the purpose of that really, is just to show that you can take adequate photographs with a mobile phone. You don't need special equipment. This one, for example, is a pair of common blue butterflies on Lucerne in Burgess Park last summer. So I have two real aims underlying this talk, is to firstly to debunk the myth that London is no good for wildlife, because that's simply not true. And second is to encourage people to get out and explore and enjoy the green spaces near them, because there's a lot of stuff out there. If you engage with it, you can find lots and lots of enjoyment, and that's good for us, as we all know. So a little bit about me first of all. What I'll cover first of all. I'm going to cover the Big City Butterflies project that's just starting up, as I said. But in doing so, you'll find out about a little bit about the butterflies of London, the life cycle of butterflies, what they do through the year, where to see butterflies in London, how you can help butterflies and help nature, and how you can get involved more generally. So there's the scenes running through it. And these two common butterflies I saw on a tree in Burgess Park earlier this year, a male and a female, and they're just sitting on the tree. So I managed to get an unusual photograph in this case. So a little bit about me before I go on. I've had a lifelong interest in butterflies and moths. I grew up in rural Dorset, and that's probably got something to do with this. But I started working in London in the early 90s, and I'm become an adopted Londoner, I think. I volunteer for Butterfly Conservation. I'm also a trustee there. I'm also a beekeeper at Walworth Garden, which is up towards Elephant and Castle. And I am a supporter of the London National Park City, and indeed now a ranger for London National Park City. And you can see here, London National Park City is a campaign, a movement, a vision to make London greener, healthier and wilder, which I think is to many people's hearts. And there's lots of things going on around the city which the London National Park City promote and do what they can to support. So this is our lovely city, an unusual view. It doesn't look a very promising place for wildlife, does it? With all these buildings, all this built environment there, it looks pretty hostile for wildlife. But that's not the case. And many of you will be familiar with this statistic that London is 47% green. The red dot there is the City of London, just to orientate you. But if you can see in this map, if my cursor is showing, you can see Richmond Park and Wimbledon Common. You can see the Lee Valley coming down here. You can see the Royal Parks, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Hampstead Heath. You can see south here, south of Croydon, the green areas there. So plenty of green areas. And where we are, Bell House is, in this sort of area of Southwark, quite green. You get north to, this is Burgess Park here, and you can see you're in an area of deficiency for access to green space. That's Battersea Park and Brockwell Park, Streatham Common and Tooting Common and Wandsworth Common. Around the edge of the city, 22% of it is green belt. Not necessarily good for wildlife because it wasn't there for that purpose. It's there to stop the urban spread, but now about a quarter of the city space is green belt. Another quarter is gardens. The gardens aren't always as green as we would like, as I would like anyway, with paved over front lawns for cars, patios and things on the back, and the abomination of plastic grass being used as well. A fifth of the land in London is one of these 1600 sinks. That means sites of importance for nature conservation, sometimes called wildlife sites. And there are over 140 local nature reserves spread across the city, and 3 national nature reserves. That's Richmond Park down here, Ruislip Woods up here, and the South London Downs in this sort of area down here. And let's not forget that the Brownfield actually is a good place for wildlife as well. So this is the City of London. I want you to focus on that. I'm going to home in a little bit because this is one of the inspirations for the project. If you can't go to the Barbican Wildlife Garden, this is from the Google map, obviously overhead. Here's a small garden right in the Barbican estate. You go in further, and in the summer, you've got a wildflower meadow that's teeming with insects. And if you are lucky, walk through, then you see things like common blue butterflies flying there. So even these small green spaces in the most built up of our city, nature thrives if it's given the opportunity. And that's one of the ideas behind Big City Butterflies. So this is an introduction to the project. And you see I've illustrated with 3 butterflies and 1 moth, all of which can be seen in London. The moth on the right-hand side is a Jersey tiger moth, which is now very common across London. It wasn't common 5 years ago, really, but it's spread very widely and can be seen flying in the daytime as well, in July or so. The marbled white on the left, the black and white butterfly, is now moving into London's parks, and because they've been managed more for wildflower meadows. Yeah, it's in Burgess Park, it's in Brockwell and Ladywell Cemetery, all places across the south of London. The orange tip, distinctive with the male butterfly there with the orange tip to its wings. I saw some of those in Burgess Park only last week when it was warmer than it is today. And on the bottom, there's a holly blue, which is common everywhere across London. You see them almost anywhere. So the sort of things which Big City Butterflies as a project is seeking to do is to help Londoners discover and connect with butterflies, moths, and the green spaces that support them. So it's trying to use butterflies and moths, the attractive insects that they are, as a way in for people to wildlife and the green spaces. There's also a thread to improve the quality and connectivity of the green spaces across London. You'll see that many of the green spaces are already quite good, but it's relatively easy to make them better, inexpensive and simple to do. To increase recording and monitoring, we've got reasonable coverage of monitoring in parts of London for butterflies and moths, probably better than other species groups, but a bit more recording and monitoring would be good. And that's a way for people to get involved, which is interesting for them. But from the butterfly conservation side, BC standing for Butterfly Conservation as an organization, it's a charity which has worked historically mainly in the rural areas of the country. And so this is a chance for Butterfly Conservation to engage with new audiences in the city. And of course, much more diverse audiences than we get out in the countryside if we're talking about Exmoor or Dorset or Devon or something like that. And it's a chance for us to develop and test new approaches to conservation in an urban context and spread those from London to Glasgow or Birmingham or wherever else we can. So lots of things we can do here with this project, which is going to go on for 4 years and have 2 project offices. So it's quite a big project by most environmental standards. So where we are, we have recruited the project officers. They're signing the papers probably as I speak. I can't give their names because we haven't released them yet, but there'll be one focusing on engagement with local communities and one focusing on conservation and habitat management. There's a whole activity list being planned, but look out for launch events in the week of the 31st of May, starting probably on the Tuesday after the bank holiday, which will be a lot of local events rather than one big event. As I said, it runs to 2025. I'll talk more about the detail of it as we go through. The 3 themes: recording and monitoring, engagement, and habitat management. And engagement is in the middle because this is the biggest focus for us in this project, because it's really want to get new audiences engaged with wildlife, and butterflies and moths have proved to be a very effective way to do that. You can see how much kids like this young person really enjoy the moth, elephant hawk moth on their finger. And it opens the world of wildlife to them in a way they wouldn't have seen before. And that's something we can do, and you'll see in school visits and so on. But opportunities for people to get involved in recording butterflies and either doing practical habitat management where that's possible, although in central London, where we're focusing our efforts, that may be more working with friends groups, lobbying park managers and boroughs, working in owned green spaces, whether that's in private gardens or housing estates or whatever, or indeed having window boxes and smaller things. So doing things like that for habitat. Now I'm going to go through some of the butterflies which you could see in London, because all these butterflies are relatively, well, most of the ones I show are going to be relatively easy to see. And all of these are flying now. These are the hibernators. These spend the winter as adult butterflies. We think of butterflies as the flying insects that you see here, but of course they go through 4 life stages, which I'll describe in a minute. And some of them spend a very short time as the flying butterfly, only a week or 2. So the red admiral on the left is very distinctive, used to be only a migrant to this country, but as climate change has warmed and we have the urban heat island effect in London as well, this is now resident here. More migrants coming every year, but people see red admirals late in December and early in January, so we know that they survive through the winter. The peacock, which you'll recognize with the distinctive eyes, which are there to scare off predators like birds, that was flying now. You see them in Burgess Park already. I'll use Burgess Park a lot because that's the park I go to most. On the bottom row, the small tortoiseshell used to be very common in gardens everywhere, much less common now, and it's in the reasons why I'm not quite certain. The comma in the middle, very distinctive. I showed the undersides of the 2 mating pair earlier on. You see the raggedy edges. This now is more common than the tortoiseshell, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it was much less common. And it's probably one of the more common butterflies you see at this time of year in the parks when you get to warm spaces. Then the very distinctive brimstone with the male is bright yellow, the female slightly greener, but with a curved and pointed wingtip here. That means it's relatively easy to spot if you see it settled. And then the white butterflies, these can be very confusing, sometimes called the cabbage whites. You see the large white here, and then the orange tip female without the orange tips to the wings, the green veined white with the veins underneath, the small white, which is a bit like the large white, only generally smaller. And again, the brimstone here, which is another one that looks white. So when you see these at a distance, it's not always obvious which one of these it is. And they can all be seen across London's parks and gardens and even the streets. But probably if you see one, it's going to be a small white. Those are very common and very prevalent. You see them as you're walking around the streets as well. Little brown ones, the 3 on the top are skippers. These are one of the more primitive families of butterflies. And you've got the large, the Essex, and the small, and they can be hard to tell apart. The large one is larger and has got different markings on the wings. The Essex skipper has these black tips to the antennae, otherwise looks very similar to the small. Then on the bottom, we've got a brown Argus, recently arrived in Burgess Park, wasn't there before. A female common blue, which is actually mostly brown, and a small copper, which you can see across many of the parks throughout most of the summer. Those little small ones, quite hard to spot sometimes. And then the 2 blues that we have, again, the common blue, the male here always looks similar to this, but the female can be anything from blue through to quite brown. And you'll see that in flying at low level in the parks, wherever there's bird's foot trefoil, like this yellow plant here, or other plants similar, but reasonably widespread. But much more common is a holly blue with this different underside of pale blue with black spots. And these ones were in Burgess Park, and she was laying an egg on the lucerne seed pods there, the flowers. So you can see that one anywhere across London. And these ones you probably haven't seen, but these fly at the top of the canopy of trees, 2 hair streaks, the white letter hair streak here and the purple hair streak on the right. This white letter feeds on elm, and it's called a white letter hair streak because of this W shape here in a white mark, which is very distinctive. Normally stays at the top of trees feeding on aphid honeydew, but if that dries up, it'll come down to the lower level to nectar and bask. And this purple hair streak is always on oak trees, so go somewhere like Streatham Common, you can see both of these butterflies near the rookery in Streatham Common. And probably the best place to see the white letter hair streak actually is Peckham Rye Park. There's an avenue of elms just to the south end of Sexby Garden, and they're disease-resistant elms, and it's a lovely avenue, and these butterflies fly there in July. If you look for long enough. In the wildflower meadow areas where they've been managed well, you get these brown butterflies, the gatekeeper with 2 white dots in the black eye spot, the meadow brown bigger with only 1 dot, the speckled wood, which likes wooded areas, as its name suggests, the marbled white, which has a brief flight period in July, August, the ringlet in slightly damper areas because of these rings, and the small heath. If you take a site like Burgess Park, which has been managed well for wildlife, these butterflies have all moved in when they probably weren't there 5 or 6 years ago. So if you build it, they will come. And that's part of the aims of the Big City Butterflies project, is to promote that sort of wildlife habitat management. And these migrants come in. We talked about the Red Admiral also breeds here. And then you'll be familiar with the Painted Lady probably, which can migrate here in vast numbers as it did in 2009. It sets off from Morocco in the hills in the spring when it starts to get hot and desiccated in that part of the world. And it can go from laying an egg to an adult in about 6 weeks. So the adults lay eggs on the way and continue northwards. And then the eggs become caterpillars, the caterpillars pupate, and then the adults emerge and they continue north. So you'll have the parents, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren will arrive here in England in the summer. And you sometimes have huge numbers, as I said. And the clouded yellow is a much rarer migrant. It likes to stay in the warmer places, and you can see it down around Croydon sometimes, but rarely in the centre of London, although not unknown. But you don't need to remember all that. I said I was a ranger with National Park City. The National Park City has now got a wiki. You'll have heard of Wikipedia. This is the same type of thing. It's a wiki about the National Park City. And I created a page on London's butterflies, which is the address for it is there. And it's got many of the pictures which you've seen. So if you want to know what a butterfly is, you've seen it in London, this would be a place to go and have a look. What we found with London is that there are over 26 kinds of butterfly which you can regularly see in the capital. And you can, if you look hard everywhere across the total area of London, find maybe 40 or so of the 59 species. But 20 to 26 is probably the number you're likely to see in the centre. But what we've shown is that if you take a park and manage it for wildlife, and I mean a park bigger than a couple of football pitches, so a hectare or so, that can support more than, or you can see more than 20 different types of butterfly in a park like that. There's no reason why any park in London couldn't be managed in a way like that, way to have 20 species of butterfly flying in the summer throughout the season. I think that's something to aspire to. So back to Big City Butterflies, the project. We're focusing on the inner London boroughs plus a couple of extra add-ons, and you can see them labelled here. My area, I chair the volunteer branch for Surrey and Southwest London, and within London in butterfly conservation, and within London that means this purple area of not that one there. It's Richmond south of the river, Wandsworth, Lambeth, Southwark, Kingston, Sutton, Merton, Sutton, and Croydon. But the project will focus on Wandsworth, Lambeth, and Southwark, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Of course, we're in Southwark, or Bell House is in Southwark, so it will be involved, and we may well involve Bell House in some of the project activities if that works out, and I'd like to think that's a possibility. Most of butterfly conservation's work, as I said, has been done in the countryside, and this is a view over Exmoor, where we've had projects in the last few years. And people think the countryside is intrinsically good for wildlife, and that the urban centres are intrinsically bad. And that's a myth which needs to be debunked, because while much of this might be good in the foreground, in the background here you've got farmed areas which are actually sterile, pretty sterile for wildlife. And when you think that over 2/3 of the land area of Britain is farmed, so one third of the area is farmed for crops, and 1/3 is farmed for grazing. And so of that cropped area, a half of that area is for crops to be fed to animals for us to eat. So bonkers system. It's led to, in the intensive agriculture, it's called untold amounts of damage since the war. We've lost so much of our wildlife, hedgerows, wildflower meadows, etc., etc. And if you look at the causes of insect declines, two of the big issues are intensive agriculture and development, buildings and roads, so tarmac and concrete, if you will. What those things lead to habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, so simply less space for wildlife, less area, and what area there is fragmented. But worse than that, the habitat that remains is degraded, so changes to management. So for example, we don't have hay meadows anymore, we don't coppice woodlands anymore, so they become overgrown. Chalk grasslands don't get grazed, so they turn into scrubby areas. And on top of all that, we load the land with chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, which make the land, as I said, fertile, which means that the plants which support the wildlife don't grow, but the crops and other plants do. So it's not so good for wildlife. And then there's air pollution, and particularly nitrogen oxides from cars and airplanes and trucks and so on. And that leads to nitrogen deposition on the land, and that leads to the land becoming more fertile, which again upsets the ecosystem. So on top of all that, you then add climate change, and in London, indeed, the urban heat island effect of several degrees, and you can see it's a pretty difficult mixture for wildlife to cope with. But London is different to, you can see this is typical London views of where wildlife might live versus the countryside. So you can see grassy wildflower areas in parks and scrubby areas, allotments, parks managed for wildlife, like on the left-hand side at the bottom, that's Burgess Park a couple of years ago, I think. I don't think it was last year. And then even railway stations with small areas, you know. So you've got a huge amount of diversity in terms of the wildlife spaces in a place like London, and diversity of habitat, diversity of structure is good for wildlife and good for biodiversity as well. So I've heard it said by senior people in London Wildlife Trust that London is probably the most biodiverse place of its size anywhere in the country because of this characteristic. And these are the sorts of spaces where the Big City Butterflies project will be wanting to get people into and have activities running. Just a bit more on the habitats in London. The two circled areas are kind of, and I've used South London because that's where we are and that's where I live. And that's, so I think but the whole of London would be similar story. The two circled areas are kind of anomalies, because in the first one here, you've got Richmond Park, Wimbledon Common and Putney Heath, very special areas for wildlife in general. And here in this part, you've got part of the North Downs and the new South London Downs National Nature Reserve, which was created and designated in 2019, linking some of the chalky areas down by south of Croydon in Croydon Borough. So those are special areas, and the rest of London really is about parks, commons, cemeteries, gardens, brownfield sites, transport corridors, and you can see the diversity we have here with I think that's Clapham Common, Wandsworth Common, Tooting Commons, Mitcham Common, Brockwell Park, Burgess Park, and so on. These are sorts of big green spaces you've got with lots of little green spaces around them. And the other interesting thing about London from a project point of view in terms of trying to manage for wildlife is that there are, apart from the private gardens, obviously, you've got relatively few landowners to talk to. The boroughs and the City of London Corporation, and north of the river, the Royal Parks are big landowners, and London Wildlife Trust, TCV, and National Trust also involved. So not so many conversations to be had with different groups. But I mentioned the Friends of groups here. These are really important in terms of how the land is managed. I was chatting with the Friends of Dulwich Park only last week with the park managers there about what could be done for wildlife. And you can see that the Friends groups do a fantastic job across London's green spaces to help them be managed better for wildlife. So if you want to go looking for butterflies and other wildlife in London, these are some of the best places to go. I'm not intending to read out the whole list, you'll be very pleased. But the kind of white trees on green are where we've got regular monitoring throughout the whole year, whole summer. And the white dots with orange, where we've got more ad hoc monitoring. But these sites listed on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are some of the best places to go for wildlife in London. And these slides can be available to you afterwards if you want. So if you want to take a copy of this, you're more than welcome. But you know, you look at the wild areas and somewhere like Cannon Hill Common or I don't know, Wandsworth Common, you'll find wildlife of all types, birds and butterflies, insects, flowers, etc., etc. It's really nature under our noses if we only care to look. And the coming back to big city butterflies again, we're using flagship sites, one in each of the core boroughs in the centre, to focus our activities on, because otherwise London is just too big an area for 2 project offices to cover. And the criteria we used to select these sites were that they had a good diversity of Lepidoptera, that's butterflies and moths, and potential for more. Examples of different management practices in the sites, and good site managers. Important that they had good access for all sorts of people with different abilities, and facilities like toilets and meeting rooms and so on, so that we could run events. And particularly important, they had community groups, friends of groups, volunteer groups, etc. The green dots there show where they are, and this slide shows the ones which we selected. The list might change a little bit as we get into the detail of it, but this I think is where we're likely to be going. So in our neck of the woods, it's Wandsworth Common, Brockwell Park, Burgess Park, Brockley and Ladywell Cemetery, and further over to the east, Oxley's Meadow, which is a slightly different side and a wonderful place if you haven't been there. And you can see the sites north of the river as well. I'm sure you'll recognise some of these places. Most of them are quite large, but not all of them. And I should say that Wormwood Scrubs applies to the scrubs, not to the prison. But yeah, so we're in discussion with all these park friends of groups and park managers, etc. This is a sort of engagement we're going to be doing, as it says up there, subject to COVID. Everything has got a COVID health warning on it, obviously. Lots of work in schools, trying to get kids in because of Key Stage 2, I think. Very amenable audiences to doing things practically getting involved with wildlife, love it, getting out in the green spaces near them. Rarely in the school grounds themselves, but going to nearby green spaces. Going into community groups. This is the project officer for the development phase of the Big City Butterflies project, which we ran a year ago. And she's demonstrating a moth trap there where we can see what moth might be present in say, Wandsworth Common or something like that. Just below that, public events. We haven't seen much of public events in the last year. But if the Lambeth Show comes back next year, we'll be there, and places and things like that, and open days and so on, demonstrating, getting people involved, giving people the chance to have hands-on opportunities to see butterflies or moths or caterpillars or whatever close up, and people love that. And then recognizing that London is a diverse community, and recognizing that the environment sector is very undiverse generally, not just butterfly conservation, but all the charities tend to be white middle class. We really want to reach out beyond our normal audiences. So working with an organization called Wild in the City, run by Beth Collier, and I think that's Beth there, had some workshops with her in the startup, and we'll have some more during the project itself. So we're hopeful that, and that will help us to get to reach audiences we don't normally reach as butterfly conservation. So that's bear in mind the nature of London and our cities generally. That's really important that we do that. So recording and monitoring, we can run workshops to help people. We will be running workshops to help people identify butterflies and moths, and setting up recording schemes in parks and cemeteries and wherever. This is where the idea of a butterfly-friendly park that's being managed, so you've got more than 20 species of butterfly, you might have a recording scheme set up to follow that on. Because I firmly believe that there's no reason why our parks couldn't have 20 or more species of butterfly, which would be great. And then the habitat management itself, either training workshops showing how you can manage for, in this case, wildflower meadows, or having site visits. And this is Burgess Park in the Burgess Park West wildlife area. It's been revamped, discussing and sharing results and so on habitat management. Much of it will be done by the boroughs, of course, not by the project itself. And this sort of pyramid shows what we're trying to achieve with volunteers and people we reach. So at the bottom in the blue layer, it's about changing perceptions and behaviors, getting people to interact slightly differently with their green spaces, just to appreciate that something's there that they might like to look at and it's worth saving. In the yellow layer above that, fewer people, but more actively involved in improving green spaces or sharing knowledge or submitting records or getting involved in other ways. And at the top, people are actually getting involved as volunteers with the local butterfly conservation groups. So a sort of hierarchical pyramid of engagement we're trying to achieve. Now coming back to butterflies again and how they spend the winter, I talked about butterflies having a life cycle that spans the whole year. And this chart covers the 24 commonest really breeding species in London. And you can see if you go around clockwise from the Peacock at top left, butterflies go through an adult phase of flying phase, and there's an egg just visible there, and that's a purple hair streak egg on an oak bud, which I took a picture of on Barnes Common actually. And then caterpillar. The caterpillar is the feeding stage. The caterpillar's primary job is just to feed and take on resources, so it can get from an egg to a chrysalis. So it needs to take on a lot of food. In fact, that's nearly all it does. Then it will pupate into a chrysalis or a pupa, and this is an orange tip pupa, hard case. And this one's about to emerge. You can see the orange wing visible. That's quite natural. That's what happens just before they come out. This is a transformation phase. So it goes from a sort of a caterpillar or larva with almost no shape or structure, and transforms here into a butterfly. Utterly astonishing metamorphosis. And the adult butterfly, that's the reproductive stage and the dispersal stage for the insect. So reproduction, dispersion, feeding and growing, and transformation. But of those 24 species, 5 of them spend the winter as an adult. Only 3, and we've seen that those are the hibernators. Only 3 as an egg. That's the 2 hair streaks and the Essex skipper. 6 as a chrysalis, and most of them, surprisingly enough, overwinter as a caterpillar. Most of the brown butterflies overwinter as a caterpillar. The chrysalises are mostly the white butterflies, which means these caterpillars will be in the, if they're in the grasses feeding in the wildflower meadows and such like in the late summer, they need somewhere to go for the winter. So cutting all that grass down and destroying it can risk killing off the populations of butterflies there. So how you manage habitats and green spaces is actually quite important, and not very difficult, but important to get right. So with all that knowledge, how can people help? How can you help? I would point out that actually here, this is an orange tip egg. You can see it's a little orangey pointed thing on garlic mustard, visible in May time. Garlic mustard growing in a sunny area. In the parks, you might find this. I found them in London before now, quite easy to see. Anyway, if you want to do something for insects, for wildlife, you can go to the Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects page, which is really good. But if you want an introduction to that, then 5 basic things you can do. The first is provide nectar for the adult butterflies and insects. And you need to make sure that nectar sources are there all season, from early spring to late summer, because we have a long season in London due to the urban heat island effect. Fortunately, we have great floral diversity as well, so it's possible to do that. Then I say if you want to feed the adults, you need to feed the kids as well. So caterpillar food plants, and this is what is often most missing. It's what you need to do most if you want to encourage butterflies into new species. It's the food plants that they need for the caterpillars. If they haven't got that, they won't have the adult butterfly. But I'll show that simple on the next slide. Then they need somewhere to shelter, either overnight or in bad weather. It's very noticeable on a showery day. The sun comes out and butterflies and insects appear. Then it rains and they disappear, and you don't know where they go. But they're in the foliage, they're in the ivy, hidden up somewhere, just out of the way. So that sort of structure in a green space is really important. And we've seen how they spend the winter, either as an egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, or adult. You need to think what sort of spaces and places they would need to be protected in those different forms over the winter. The fourth thing which you can do is not use any chemicals, because insecticides kill insects. It's in the name, isn't it? Use of chemicals is one of the biggest problems in the countryside. Fortunately, in London, most of the boroughs don't use chemicals in their parks anymore, although there's still some work to do. Some of them do on the streets. So the parks are relatively benign places for insects. And if they're managed well, then in terms of the structure and planting in them, then insects come in. And finally, a pond. It's been said that the best way to increase biodiversity in a green space is to have a pond, however small. Now, if you've got a very small green space, like obviously you go to the extreme of a window box, then you're probably just putting nectar plants out there for flying insects. With a bit more space, you can add caterpillar food plants and shelter, and a bigger space still you can add a pond and so on. So, but whatever space you've got, whether it's your own space, a shared space, or a borough space, there's something that can be done. And the thing to remember is that if it's good for insects, it'll be good for other wildlife. So if you see butterflies flying in the park, there will be other insects. If there are insects, there'll be spiders, there'll be bats, there'll be birds to eat the caterpillars. So the fact you've got insects is showing that you've got a rich diversity of wildlife in that park, which is why butterflies are important as indicators to monitor. And here's a list of caterpillar food plants for London's butterflies. And it's surprisingly short, isn't it? The grasses, you don't want things like the ryegrass and the rapid growing grass and the stuff they use in football pitches. What you need is the cocksfoot grass, like the one I've shown here, fescues, bents, and so on, the more delicate grasses. These are what the brown butterflies, caterpillars feed on. And if you make a wildflower meadow, that's what you'll get. And that's why you'll have those butterflies moving in. Nettles are very good for the tortoiseshells and the commas and the peacocks. They can be put in, stand of nettles growing in sunshine normally in the corner of a park somewhere out of the way where people can't get stung is really effective at improving the prevalence of those butterflies. And Burgess Park has done a lot of that in the spaces where people can't get to. Nasturtiums and other brassicas for the cabbage whites. All sorts of plants there that they'll feed on. Quite a wide variety. And then I put bird's foot trefoil, vetches and lucerne, things like that are good for the blue butterflies. Garlic mustard or cuckoo flower is good for the orange tip. It's the only butterfly which uses those. But if you plant garlic mustard in a sunny place, in a hedge or by a wall or somewhere like that, roadside, pathway side, in sunshine, then the orange tips will be laying on it in a year or two, I'm sure. Sorrels and docks are for the small copper butterfly, and things like dove's cranesbill and geranium species are for the brown argus. Thistles are for the painted lady, and ivy is for the holly blue. Now, ivy is a really important plant beyond the holly blue because it provides roosting places for insects and spiders and all sorts of other things, and indeed birds as well. And people have a tendency to rip it off of buildings and so on because they don't like it, but it's really important. And it's also an important nectar source late in the season. So if you find walking by a canal or in a park by a railway or whatever, a lot of ivy growing on the fence in the sunshine in October, November, you will see it full of insects, including sometimes red admirals and things like that. So a really good plant to have around with late nectar. And finally, trees. 3 species of trees that are important. The oak and the elm I mentioned as being good for the 2 hair streaks, but the buckthorn is the food plant for the caterpillar of the brimstone butterfly. Now, there's not so much buckthorn around in London, but there could be a lot more because it's a nice little tree. And we've shown that if you plant buckthorn and allow it to grow, the butterflies like to lay their eggs on youngish trees, and you'll get brimstones moving in quite quickly. So really is a case of if you build it, they will come. It's simple as that. And this is an example of management of parks. This is Burgess Park a few years ago, and then 2 years later. I know it's a winter picture and a summer picture, but believe me, this area was pretty sterile going way back, and now last year we had TV crews coming to film for projects that we were supporting, the big butterfly count in Burgess Park, and it was just buzzing with butterflies and other insects. It was lovely to see, and that can be done in a pretty short time without much cost. And if you want to create flower-rich meadows and grasslands, the key to do it is to have a low nutrient soil, a low fertility soil. Then lots of plants can compete for the limited nutrients, and you don't need to mow it as much either. So it's a really good idea. This is a picture from Hutchinson's Bank down south of Croydon near New Addington, and it's a chalk area that I mentioned earlier, and the remnant of the North Downs. So it's the same underlying soil geology. It's chalk, which is visible here on the left-hand side. But here, the surface soil has been scraped off and moved away, and further to the right, it hasn't. In the 5 years since this has been done, this has not been treated in any way at all. That's the only growth you've got on it. Whereas on the right-hand side, you've got dogwood and scrub coming up, and it's going to be secondary woodland before too long. But this part on the left is full of butterflies, and especially the small blue in this case. So, but a very easy way to reduce soil fertility is to use cut and collect mowing, and you could do this on your garden at home. Actually, it can be done anywhere. You let the grass go as tall as your mower will allow, preferably a couple of feet. Cut it and take all the stuff away, and let it grow again, and cut it and take it all away, and repeat that and repeat that. And what's happening is the nutrients are coming out of the soil into the growth and being removed. And you'll find that in a year, in the second year, you'll have to cut it much less. In the third year, you will have a very short sward length, and you can seed it with a native flower mix, and you've got a wildflower meadow. And if you do that, you need to cut it very late in the season to avoid August or September, to avoid damaging to allow the plants to set seed for a start, and to let the caterpillars get old enough so that they can survive elsewhere. So just as we're closing out, how getting involved could mean spotting butterflies and recording what you see. Well, there's an app available from both app stores, Apple and Google, called iRecord Butterflies. There's a new version coming next month, I believe, with more functionality. But that's a very good way because it's got a butterfly guide in it. It tells you what you're seeing. And then on the right-hand side is something much less known, but actually quite handy. And it's produced by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is where the CEH comes from in the web address. But if you type in, if you use this app with your location services turned on your smartphone, it will give you a list of the butterfly species seen in that area in the last few years from the database of records. And that can be quite handy because if you're not sure what something is, this gives you a start to look at what it might be. So in conclusion then, London is good for wildlife and good for butterflies. Just need to look. The Big City Butterflies projects will offer lots of opportunities for people of all ages to get involved locally. And that word locally is actually quite important, because we want people to get involved in near where they live or work, and not have to travel miles out into the countryside to do something, because the opportunities are there right under their noses. And if you want to get involved and help wildlife, there's simple and cheap things you can do, because what's good for nature is good for us. Now I'm going to do, this is a shameless plug for myself, I'm afraid, but in the summer, I'm doing a sponsored bike ride from Land's End to John O'Groats, which is sometimes called Le Jog by people in the cycling community. And the aim of this is to raise money for butterfly conservation and to promote the need to take care of nature. All being well, COVID willing, I'm starting on the 22nd of June and taking 30 days to cycle the 1,200 miles by bike, visiting as many reserves as possible. So publicity about that will start very shortly. I wanted to delay until we got through the COVID thing as far as possible, so the risk of cancellation again, because it was due to happen last year, had to be postponed. So if you're interested in that, would like to get involved, and then the links are there. So do spread the word on that one. I'll be tweeting and putting the publicity about it very shortly. And just in closing, I need to acknowledge plenty of people here who've supported and made this possible. The people at Butterfly Conservation, of course, the many volunteers who do all sorts of work, either recording, monitoring talks like this, habitat work, producing materials, running websites, etc., etc. All the Friends of groups who do such a brilliant job around the parks and green spaces in London, and the London boroughs who really are doing what they can to make our parks and places better for wildlife, and in particular the National Lottery Heritage Fund for this project. So I'll leave it there. My email address and Twitter are there if you want to get in touch with me, and available for questions, of course. And if you'd like copies of the slides, I can make them available, so you don't have to take notes on the bits which we've got detailed data on. So thank you very much.